Does anyone? Those are clips from two different films. Does anyone recognize? Anyone recognize those films? Anyone know? One is from the 70s. One's from the 80s. One of them actually caused quite a bit of controversy. Anyone know? Yes, Mr. Kozlowski?
Jesus Christ Superstar.
Yes, the last clip is from the 70s rock opera called Jesus Christ Superstar. And the first one, anyone know? Mr. Malone? A guess? Or don't know? There's so many to choose from. So many Jesus movies. Okay. Well, you might not get this one, you know. The Last Temptation of Christ. Directed by, what's his name? Scorsese, but now I'm blanking on his first name. Anyways, but it was from the 80s, and it caused some, as you can probably tell from the name of the movie, The Last Temptation of Christ, it caused some controversy. It was based on a book that actually was written by a Greek author, a fictional book, so you're not going to find it in your New Testament, or from the early writings of Christianity. And but the premise of the book, just to give you a short little, idea what the book is about, is that Jesus is hanging on the cross and the devil appears and offers him this temptation. What if you could come down from the cross, Jesus, and live a normal life? Okay, and that's the premise of the book. Anyways, and the premise of the movie. And I might show another clip from the movie when Jesus meets St. Paul. But anyways, but I just thought the crucifixion scene, since we're going to talk about the crucifixion today, was relevant and is interesting in some ways for its depiction of the crucifixion. I hope you enjoyed the music from Savior Machine, which is a goth metal band, Christian goth metal band. And so there is that. But it is also Black History Month, and I want to continue honoring Black American Catholics who are on their way to sainthood, such as this lady here, Venerable Henriette DeLisle. I can't see her name on here. Oh, actually, you can if I go down a little bit. Hold on here. Can you see that? Venerable Henriette DeLisle? There you go. Okay. When did she live? Whoops. I keep looking for my pocket. 1813 until 1862. That's interesting. Because my notes are kind of all over the place here. I just saw something that's interesting here. Okay, whatever. She was from New Orleans, Louisiana. Okay, which had New Orleans was colonized by the French, so there are a lot of Catholics down there, a lot of Catholic influence in Louisiana, and eventually, I think it was under Thomas Jefferson with the Louisiana Purchase, we bought that area, and it came under American control. So she was an American, but she was of French ancestry, and she was Catholic. New Orleans. She was a free woman of color, or sometimes called a Creole of color. I guess because she was of mixed African ancestry and other ancestry. She was mixed French and she was mixed African and possibly Spanish. She would have been considered black still. I mean, whites would have still considered her black. And she is... interesting. I won't mention that. In 1836, before I get to that, she wanted to become a nun, and she does found an order of nuns, but she was quite a pretty woman, and it was the custom in New Orleans society that women would kind of pair off. They'd have kind of like these balls where women would pair off with men, not for marriage purposes, usually for some kind of concubinage. And you have to remember, this is a Catholic city. New Orleans was a very Catholic city, and yet they did these sorts of things. And, they tried to do this to Henriette, Venerable Henriette, and she rejected this. Number one, she wanted to become a nun, but she also objected to the implications of it, which was sex outside of marriage. But she did want to become a nun. In 1836, she founded the Sisters of the Holy Family. the Sisters of the Holy Family, which is our only second surviving community of Black sisters that we have. Just go back here. Our first community we haven't gotten to yet, that's Mother Mary Lang, and she's, okay, so I'll talk about her later, but there was already a first community of Black sisters that had been founded. She founded the second surviving community of Black sisters. She was a teacher at a school for Black girls, and she, as I said, she resisted this system which was called plissage, which I already mentioned, which was kind of a form of concubinage where you would place young girls with men who would not marry them, but would kind of have them as their sexual partners. Just trying to read my writing here, my handwriting. I wrote it down the notes with my left hand, which I probably shouldn't have done. I should have used my normal hand, my primary hand. Okay. Nevertheless, she resisted this position, but I mean, she's on her way to sainthood, but she's a human being. So, human beings live in the world and things happen. So it's possible she may have still had 2 children out of wedlock, even though she did not want to participate in this system of concubinage. Her mother developed mental problems, and so Henriette got the estate that the family had. And she places her mom with help and uses the money to found her order. So that allows her from the estate, her family estate, which shows she had some money, the family had some money, that she's able to fulfill her dream of founding founding an order of Black nuns. The purpose of this order was to take care of the poor, the sick, the elderly, also to teach slaves. Because she was still technically Black, because she did have African ancestry, although you can see she's very white-skinned. She probably could have passed as white, but she didn't. But nevertheless, since she was still considered Black, the Bishop of New Orleans would not allow her members to wear a habit. The nuns, people who are in religious orders in the Catholic Church will often wear these special distinct clothing like uniforms. A lot of these uniforms come from the Middle Ages and stuff like that. And it's just a custom, okay? It's one of the things I think that makes religion kind of fun in some ways. A lot of nuns don't wear them anymore. They just wear maybe business suits and stuff like that. Maybe a little pin with a cross or the emblem of their religious order, but they don't, a lot of nuns don't do it. But in the past they did, okay? But because they were Black sisters, the Catholic Archbishop or the Catholic Bishop of New Orleans would not allow them to wear these outfits. And they also could not take public vows. Why he allowed or did not allow this? Probably because he thought it might agitate people in the community who were, racists. I mean, what else can you say? They had racist views and would not take kindly to having these Catholic nuns kind of sashaying around in their habits and stuff like that. So it might agitate people. So they could only take private vows. She died while the Union Army was occupying New Orleans. So remember, she was part of the Civil War. You can see from her dates, not to the end of the Civil War, which ended in 1965, but she was there. I don't know which side she supported. I don't know if there's any evidence of that. I mean, Louisiana was a slave state, and so it was participating in that. So I don't know what her views were, but you can probably imagine. Anyways, when the Union Army was occupying New Orleans is when she died. And in her will, again, you have to deal with the human element here as well as the saintly. We have this little detail where she freed her slave, Betsy, after her death. So this free woman of color, she wasn't an enslaved woman, she was a free woman. She was of color, she was Black, and yet she owned a slave. And she didn't think it was her Christian duty, apparently, to free the slave. Only upon her death did that happen. So that kind of tells you that slavery in the United States is a very complicated issue. Everyone's got some kind of dirt on their hands from it, even a saintly woman like this. So her cause for canonization was opened, I presume, by the Archdiocese of New Orleans, and she is She is at the second level on the way to sainthood. She has been declared a venerable, so she can be venerated and honored by Catholics, Henriette DeLille. In 2001, there was a movie about her on Lifetime, which is kind of like the Women's Network, played by Vanessa Williams. I don't know if anyone knows Vanessa Williams. She was a model. She's an actress. Okay. Anyways, so I think she was also Miss USA at one point. I think she won Miss USA, Vanessa Williams. But anyways, she played her Henriette DeLille in this movie. You should look it up on YouTube, see if maybe they uploaded it to YouTube. But anyways, so that is her history. And so I asked Venerable Henriette DeLille for her prayers that God may bless us and help us, that for those that maybe do have racist views, that their hearts may be converted towards loving other people of other races and colors, and maybe not have those views anymore. Amen. Maybe I'll talk about this more when we talk about Mary and the saints, but saints are not perfect, as you can tell from her story. They're human beings, okay? The thing that makes them a saint is that they are maybe what you could say fully human. They are fully searching for God and in some ways are finding Him. But you'll find this in all the stories of the saints. You know, they're determined by their culture and their society just like anybody else. But their one passion is their search for God and finding God and trying to live according to His will. Sometimes they don't always succeed, and we can see that in the case of Venerable Henriette. You know, she seems to have owned a slave. She had a couple kids out of wedlock. You know, she wasn't, maybe your normal saint, okay? But it can't be denied. It's part of her history, and it's there. Okay. Henriette DeLille. Okay. Where do we stop? I talked about Jesus went around teaching. He came into conflict with the religious leaders of his day. They accused him of being a blasphemer. They accused him of being lax in his following of Jewish teachings. And amongst other things, he accused them of being hypocrites, of not following the Jewish religion authentically. Jesus also faults the religious leaders for not recognizing his superior authority. Jesus recognizes their authority to teach the religion, but Jesus kind of sees himself on a level above the religious leaders, which they should recognize in some way. Get my Bible out here. We look in the Gospel of John, chapter 8. Let's see if I put this little notation down here, hopefully. Sense. Let's see. Chapter 8, verse 12. Okay, here we go. It's in the Gospel of John, chapter 8. You want to look at verse 12. Eight, 12, and following verses. Does anyone want to read that? Do you have it and want to read it? So that I don't have to. Not that I don't mind, it's the Word of God, but help me out. Go ahead, Mr. Zayas Basan. Start with verse 12.
I said Joshua.
Yes.
Jesus spoke.
Yep.
Jesus spoke to them again, saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me not walk in darkness, will have the light of life. So Pharisees said to him, you testify on your own behalf, so your testimony cannot be verified. Jesus answered and said to them, even if I I do testify for my own behalf. My testimony is verified, because I know where I came from and where I am going. But you do not know where I come from or where I am going. You judge by appearances, but I do not judge anyone. And even if I should judge, my judgment is valid, because I am not. But it is I and the Father who sent me. Even in your law, it is written that the testimony of two men can be verified. I testify on my behalf, and so does the Father who sent me. So they said to him, Where is your Father? Jesus answered, You know neither me nor my Father. If you knew me, you would know my Father also. He spoke these words while teaching in the treasury of the temple area, but no one arrested him because his hour had not come.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, sir. Okay, so Jesus uses this metaphor of he being the light of the world. Okay, so he is the light that illumines the whole world. You think kind of like the sun in a way. So he is above, he's in a way a transcendent object, okay? He encompasses the whole world, not just Israel. Right, so he's beyond that. But the religious leaders, these Pharisees, the Pharisees were a group of religious leaders. They weren't the only religious leaders. They were kind of like rabbis. They were teachers. They were a particular group within Judaism that were focused on teaching the law and the faithful observance of the law. They were very well respected amongst the common people, but they weren't very powerful. Like, they weren't the priests in the temple who had a lot of power and political power. But they appear a lot in the story of Jesus, which makes sense because they usually ministered amongst the common people. But the Pharisees responded to Jesus like, but Jesus, you're saying this on your own. This is just you saying this. What's your authority for this? It can't be verified. But Jesus says it can be verified because even in the law of Moses, when there's a crime, you need at least 2 witnesses to verify the charge of the crime. Okay, not just one person saying that somebody did it. You need at least 2. And Jesus draws on this analogy saying, look, even in your law, which is an interesting way because Jesus is a Jew too, so it's his law as well. But he speaks about almost like he's apart from them. He's separate from it. It's your law. Okay. It's Jesus' law too, but Jesus kind of like distinguishes and sets himself even above the law. He says, your law says this, and I do have 2 witnesses according to the law. I have myself and my Father. So he's, it's not just him, it's also his Father, God, in other words, God, who is verifying his testimony about who he is. So he's placing himself above these religious teachers. Okay, I am the light of the world, the whole world. You are teachers of Israel. You, the Pharisees, you base your teachings on the law that you've received from God, but God himself directly witnesses to me. It's an interesting little statement there in verse 18 where when Jesus mentions his Father, the Pharisees respond, where is your Father? Like, and sometimes you want to pause. Sometimes we read these stories so much in the stories of Jesus, or you hear them in church, that they just are stories that they wash over you when you don't maybe hear all the details. But sometimes you want to read the story slowly or ask questions, even with every sentence, about why is this here? What's going on? Why do they ask where his Father is? Now, John does not have the story of the virgin birth of Jesus, but he hints here and there that there's something unusual about the origins of Jesus. And his opponents seem to know this because they say, like, where is your Father, Jesus? Don't you have a father? And not here, but in another place they say to Jesus, like, we know who our father is. Father Abraham, our ancestor. Kind of like, you don't know who your father is, Jesus. And Jesus keeps referring to God as his Father. He never refers to his earthly father. So it's an interesting little comment there by his opponents when they're arguing with him, almost as a slight, like, you don't have a father, Jesus. There's something unusual about where you came from. Which doesn't necessarily mean that they thought Jesus came from God. It could also be a slight on his birth, like Jesus, you don't even know who your father is. It's like making an insult of him or something like that. But Jesus comes into conflict because of these issues as well. He seems to place himself at a level higher even than the religious authorities amongst his own people. So this all comes to a head. And around 33 AD, Jesus of Nazareth is arrested by the Jewish leadership. And the Jews, since they were a conquered people, did not have the power of capital punishment. The Romans always reserved that for themselves over the groups that they conquered. They wanted that control. So they had to hand Jesus over to the Roman authorities if they wanted him to be punished or executed. And so, according to the story, they do. They hand him over to this man called Pontius Pilate, who was prefect of the province of Judea from 26 until 36 AD. He ruled over Judea in the name of the Roman emperor with his power and authority from 26 to 36 AD. What is a prefect? A prefect is someone in the Roman government who has the power of taxation and also has the power of the military. So he has kind of not just taxation, but also policing efforts within the province. Outside of the New Testament and a few references to him in other Jewish writers of the day, we really don't know a lot about Pontius Pilate. We have no clue where he was born. We don't know when he died. We don't know where he was from originally. He is obviously mentioned in the New Testament in relation to the story of Jesus, but he's also mentioned in our old friend Josephus Flavius and Josephus's history of the Jews that he writes. He's also mentioned in the writings of another Jewish author named Philo, who lived in Egypt, in the city of Alexandria in Egypt. So he's called Philo of Alexandria. And the impression we get from the details in the writings of Josephus and Philo was that Pontius, at least from a Jewish perspective, Pontius Pilate was not a very nice guy. He was not someone you really wanted to mess with, certainly, but he also was not a very nice ruler over the Jews. He liked to antagonize the Jewish population. And, his actions would sometimes stir up riots and disturbances amongst the Jews. He would do things that would offend them. Like I think, if I remember correctly, at one time he tried to bring emblems of the Roman soldiers would walk around with these poles, and on top of these poles would be the emblems of the Roman Empire and stuff like that, which were images, and that offended the Jews because you weren't supposed to make images of like eagles and stuff like that they would have on their emblems, their standards. And he tried to bring those emblems into Rome. He tried to bring them into Jerusalem, the holy city. And the Jews objected very strongly to that because these were images that were violating the law of God. So he did stuff like that. He was kind of tone deaf to the population he was ruling. These were the New Testament, and these references in Josephus and Philo were our only evidence for the existence of this man Pontius Pilate. And they were literary references. They were written references. We had no hard evidence of his existence until 1961. In 1961, they were digging around Israel. 1961. They were digging around Israel, in northern Israel, and they found what is called the Pilate inscription. They found this piece of stone, which seems to have been from a building that Pontius Pilate had built in honor of the Roman Emperor Tiberius. You remember Tiberius because he was the emperor that Luke tells us in his gospel. Tiberius was the emperor when Jesus started his ministry around the age of 30. 50 year Tiberius. And you can see the name here. You can see the beginning of the name. You kind of see a T here and an I and a B. And you can see Pontius Pilate's name. It's broken off, but you can clearly tell whose name it is. Pontius Pilatus. And the picture's a little bit grainy. I have to step back a little bit to see it better. I can't make it out. I should use a better picture. But anyway, and down here it says he's prefectus, and so it identifies him as the prefect, which is, again, an interesting detail because until 1961, when they found this, historians actually had it wrong. They thought Pontius Pilate was another type of Roman official. They thought he was the procurator of Judea, which is kind of different. I mean, a procurator had the powers of taxation, but he didn't have military policing powers. But this stone kind of corrected that historical error. He's called specifically a prefect. He had both of those powers in Judea. So now we know. So they bring Jesus before this man, Pontius Pilate, who seems to have been in existence. He seems to have been a historical figure. And Jesus is put on trial. Jesus is judged guilty of crime by Pilate, and he's sentenced to death by crucifixion. Which would have only been... oh, wait a second. I thought I changed that. Change that on the PowerPoint. Let me just go a little bit further here and see if I did. Darn it. I changed the PowerPoint. Make sure I have the right one. I just made some changes to the PowerPoint I uploaded. And I wanted to put it. It was in a little bit different order. I just changed the order a bit and added a few slides. But apparently, it did not take. I thought that. Let's see here. Nope. Okay. That seems to be right. Okay, we'll go back to this one. I do want to go to this. Okay. Crucifixion, Jesus was to be executed by crucifixion, which was really the only way for Jesus to die. Crucifixion, a Roman citizen could not be crucified. You would have your head cut off. That was seen as more, what's the word I'm looking for? Merciful. That's the word I'm looking for. It was a more merciful death. It was quick and it was over with. If you were a non-Roman citizen, then the only option for you was to be crucified. And you didn't want to be crucified because it was a horrible form of death. What was crucifixion? You have there, or can see there, a definition of the term. It was a form of capital punishment. That's what it was used for. To execute people. That was the purpose. And you would be affixed. There would be a stake that was placed in the ground, pre-existing. Jesus would not have carried the whole cross there. It would have been already in the ground because of efficiency. The Romans were nothing if not efficient, and they crucified a lot of people. So you weren't going to have everybody carrying a cross to the place for crucifixion. You would just have all the stakes set up already. And what they would do is they would carry the beam of the cross, the wood of the cross, that would be suspended from the stake, and the person would be nailed to the cross and then hoisted up onto the stake in the ground where they would hang. And eventually what happens with crucifixion is it's not the blood. I mean, yes, Jesus was, in the story, Jesus is nailed to the cross. He's nailed in probably his wrists and in his feet. But they didn't, the Romans crucified in a number of ways. They didn't have to nail someone to a cross. They could have tied someone to the cross. If they nailed someone, it's probably because they wanted the person to suffer more. They wanted to prolong the suffering, increase the suffering. So they draw blood. Also, yes, you see, for example, not on this cross, unfortunately, but you will sometimes see on crosses or crucifixes that Jesus has a footstool that he's standing on. Maybe you've seen this. Yeah, the Romans would sometimes put a little piece of wood that, not really for the feet, it was more for your butt, that you would kind of be perched on your butt. And again, this helped you to lift yourself up, but that wasn't an act of mercy by the Romans. It was meant to give you support, which would have the effect of making you stay on the cross even longer, so you would die slower and not faster. The purpose was not blood, even though if they nailed you to the cross, obviously you would bleed and be in that sort of pain. The purpose was suffocation. That as you're suspended in your free weight, and you're pushing yourself up with your legs and also with your abdomen over and over and over again, eventually the muscles become exhausted and you can't do it anymore. You fall down and your diaphragm basically collapses and you can't take a breath anymore and you suffocate. And this can take days. It's very painful. Not a nice way to die. So, people sometimes focus on, the blood of the cross and Jesus shedding his blood on the cross. And okay, yeah, Jesus shed his blood on the cross, and that was painful, but that's not the purpose of crucifixion. The end result is for you to asphyxiate. You can see here that the word crucifixion comes from two Latin words, crux, which means a cross, and facio, which means to make. To make. All right. Just a little shout out, because I know my focus is mainly on Catholicism because this is a Catholic university, but I do want to give a shout out to other Christians and what they believe. If you've ever encountered like Jehovah's Witnesses, they do not believe in the crucifixion. They believe that it was not a cross, but it was just a stake in the ground, and Jesus was like nailed like this on the stake. Problem with that is that the Romans could crucify that way, but that wasn't the normal way. I mean, and even the name of the word or the description of what it is, making a cross, tells you probably how Jesus was crucified. Although, again, I wasn't there, nor were the Jehovah's Witnesses. So, if I get to heaven and I find out, Jesus was crucified like this, not like this, I'll say, okay, Jesus, that's fine. Where is the Indian buffet? Because that's all I'm looking for in heaven. I was wrong about the crucifixion, Jesus, but let's have some bhajis. Yes, Mr. Coons.
So I have a question about the crucifixion.
Go ahead.
Because a lot of people like to say this, but I'm not sure how true it is. I thought I'd get your perspective on it. Some people say that Jesus was also sodomized. That's because they said that it was part of the crucifixion prior to as he was naked to humiliate.
Yes.
Some people like to say that he was also sodomized. I'm not sure how. I couldn't find any actual facts on that, but I wanted to see if you had anything on that.
I've never heard that.
Yeah,
I've never heard that argument. I'm not going to say the Romans, although I can't imagine that the Roman soldiers would take their time doing that. Whipping could be part of it. Whipping a person to kind of soften them up for the crucifixion, which also happened to Jesus. So you can kind of tells you how the Romans viewed Jesus, because they went all out on him. They didn't have to whip him. They didn't whip everyone for crucifixion, but they whipped Jesus. They also nailed him, which they didn't have to do. They could have tied him. They gave him possibly a footstool to perch on. That's not in the Gospels, though. That's coming from tradition, so it might not be true. But no, I've never heard the theory that, or the opinion that Jesus had to be, or any person who was going to be subjected to crucifixion had to be sodomized or raped, sexually raped.
Yeah, I didn't take much truth to it. I was sort of said that to me in a mocking way, as
okay,
your God was sodomized. I was like, I don't think that's true, so I thought I'd ask more.
Okay.
Accurate source.
I mean, I guess my response would be, if Jesus was physically raped, it was forced on him. So what does that mean?
Yeah.
How?
My response to that too.
It's kind of like, in one case he's raped, in another case he's killed. I mean, they're both pretty bad. Pretty bad things to happen. But I've never heard it, so I can't comment on it. I'd have to do more research and see who's making the statement, where they're getting their evidence from. So I can't say 100% that the Romans never did that in the crucifixion, although in my studies of what they did in crucifixion, I've never come across that practice as part of the practice. But I can't say 100% they never did it because I haven't researched into that. I have to look into it. Okay. You did mention that, and I should have mentioned this, and you might have noticed in the Scorsese film, still can't remember his name. Maybe it'll pop into my head. I want to say Michael Scorsese, but that doesn't sound right. Oh, well. Anyways, you might have noticed that the actor, Willem Dafoe, by the way, in case you're wondering, is nude. He's naked. And that's another thing about crucifixion is that, no, the Romans didn't cover up their victims and give them a nice little loincloth so you couldn't see their genitals. You were nude. It was meant to shame you. So it's all out there in front of your family and your friends, your bits. So they can see and people can make fun or they can just be generally ashamed. It was meant to shame people. So Jesus was most likely nude on the cross, as is portrayed accurately, I think, in the film by Scorsese. So crucifixion, in case you haven't figured this out, but I'll say it anyways, was an horrific practice. And it was only reserved for outlaws and the lowest of the low, especially not those who were non-Romans, but certainly the lowest of the row. As I said to you before, and I'll say it again, Roman citizens could never be crucified. That's how bad it was. You could never crucify a Roman citizen. It was out of the question because it was such a horrible practice. Due to the shameful and humiliating death that Jesus had, his followers lost faith in him. There were few of them at the cross. If you believe the stories, maybe his mother was there. I say maybe because only the Gospel of John mentions her being there. The other Gospels don't. There were some women who were followers of Jesus who were there. None of the apostles, the 12 apostles, were apparently there. Although possibly, again, the Gospel of John says that one of them was there, but who knows. But then we can say most of them were not there. No one was, Jesus was taken down from the cross and buried. No one was even at the tomb. Didn't they know Jesus was going to rise from the dead? Either they didn't know or they just didn't believe anymore. I don't know, but they weren't there waiting. And they hide their following of Jesus. They don't want people to know that they were followers of Jesus of Nazareth. Some of them go back to their previous way of life, like Simon Peter, who was the head of the 12 apostles, chosen by Jesus, given the nickname The Rock, because he was so faithful. He goes back to fishing. What else is he going to do? For Jesus' enemies, they could claim that this vindicated their opposition to Jesus. Look, God did not save him. He could not be the Messiah. He was killed. He was punished for his sins, for his sinful behavior. So for Jesus' enemies, this seems like, yeah, okay, this vindicates everything we thought about Jesus, that he wasn't a good man. Okay. Why is this picture there? This is a fascinating picture. It dates from around 200 AD, so from the 3rd century. It was, I believe, found in Rome, and it's called the Alexamenos Graffito. So I know it's in small writing, but hopefully you can see that. A graffito is like, you know what graffiti is. It's writing on a wall. People spray paint messages or symbols or their signs or whatever their name is, their nickname is, or their handle, or they do pictures and stuff like that. We call it graffiti. That's the plural form. When you have a bunch of pictures. When you have just one, it's called a graffito. So we have this one picture here of a crucifixion, which is interesting because we don't have a lot of pictures. I think this might be our only one of crucifixions. And here we have a man on a cross. So again, that gives me some historical evidence that probably Christians like the Jehovah's Witnesses are not correct in how Jesus was crucified. That it was not just a stake in the ground, but it was a stake with a beam across it, crooks. And so he's on a cross. He's on a footstool. It has a footstool. That's interesting. Doesn't mean that Jesus still had a footstool, but it does show that it was more common practice than than one might think. Got a picture of another guy here on the left-hand side who is raising his hand to this image of this man. What is unusual about the man on the cross, do you think? Mr. Coons.
Doesn't seem like he has a
Yes, he seems to have an animal's head. Horse, donkey, we don't know. We don't know what was in the mind of the artist who etched this graffito on the wall. But yeah, it's a man with an animal's head, Mr. Malone. Weird.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? But there's more than that. There's writing in Greek. Now, this was found in Rome, but notice that the right... sorry. I don't know if I should answer it or not. I'm not going to call him back. Come on. Sorry about that. So there's writing here. It's in Greek. Now remember, this was found in Rome. Should it be in Latin, which was the language of the Romans? Well, yeah, the common language of the Romans was Latin. That was the native language, the language of most communication, business, education, stuff like that, was the Greek language. That was the common language that people spoke. So, it's not surprising that it's in Greek. Now, we can make this out. It says, and I'll write it out for you. I'll write over the words here in Greek. Alexa, where are we here? Menos sebete theon. There it is. Those are the Greek letters. In English, it would be Alexamenos Sabete Theon. What does that mean? Well, in English, roughly translated, it means this man, Alexamenos, it's a man's name, Alexamenos worships God. Worships God. Or it could be honors God, but he worships or honors God. And you can see him doing this because you have a picture of this. Apparently, this is Alexamenos. This is meant to be a picture of Alexamenos raising his hand. Okay, and this was a sign of respect. Okay, in Roman culture. All right, the Nazis did not invent this. This comes from the Romans way back when, 2,000 years before the Nazis. It was a way of, like hailing someone. Hail, salve, greeting somebody. So he's greeting his God, and it's an act of worship. He's acknowledging his God, who is a God, apparently, who was hanged on a cross. Well, I do teach a course on world religions, and I find religions fascinating, so I study stuff on various religions. I don't know a lot. I know enough to be dangerous. But I have not come across a religion that says that its God was crucified except for Christianity. That's the only religion I know of in the world that claims that its God was killed on a cross or hung on a cross. So this seems to be, scholars believe it is, our earliest evidence or picture of the crucified Jesus, of an image. And it's not by a Christian, because it's making fun of it. Apparently, because it gives Jesus an animal's head. He's not depicted as a man on a cross. He's depicted as a man with an animal's head. And it's making fun of Alexamenos, who is foolishly worshiping this crucified man, which to the Roman mind was just, unbelievable. The guy's a criminal. He died as a criminal. He died shamefully. And you say he's God and worship him? If you're trying to get into the mind of the person who did this picture, if you extrapolate, okay? But it's the earliest image we have of the crucifixion of Christ. It's not done by, apparently it's not done by a Christian, and it's not even a favorable depiction of the crucifixion. But it is also interesting in another way because it acknowledges very early on the belief Christians had that Jesus was God. Because it says Alexamenos is worshiping his God on the cross. or who died on a cross, apparently. Okay. So now we have the question of why did Jesus die? It's a historical question as well as a religious question. I'm going to look at it more from the historical point of view. What details can we get from the writings about Jesus? What do they tell us about why he died? It might not be so obvious. That bothers me because I know I did that and then I transferred it over here. I'll figure it out later and then I'll be annoyed. But whatever, you do what you can do. One thing we have to remember, the Jews as a whole group, or as a nation, did not kill Jesus. That's something, because sometimes, and it's probably not as prevalent an argument that you'll hear nowadays, but you do still sometimes hear it amongst Christian groups that the Jews killed Christ, they killed their Messiah, they killed their God, etc., and so forth. But that's really inaccurate because the Jews cannot be blamed as a whole group of people for killing Jesus. Yes, some Jews rejected Jesus, like the religious leaders, although not all of them. If you read the Gospels, there were a few religious leaders who believed in Jesus and were followers of him. Yes, there were some Jews who opposed him. There were some that even thought he needed to be executed for some of the things he was doing. Many of the Jewish leadership, it seemed to reject him and condemn him, but a sizable number of Jews did accept Jesus. Jesus did seem to have crowds of Jews following him around, believing in him and following him. And they did not reject him. They did not call for his death. It's also good to remember that his mother was a Jew. Obviously, his father, Joseph, or his adoptive father, you could say, was a Jew. The apostles were Jews. All of the early disciples that we know of were Jewish. And if anything, it doesn't. I'll pass over this. If anything, it was the Romans who actually and technically condemned and crucified Jesus. The Jews did not do that. They handed Jesus over. Okay, the religious leadership handed Jesus over to the Romans, but technically they're the ones who hanged him on the cross, not the Jews. So it doesn't make any more sense to blame the Jews as a group for the death of Christ than one could blame, all Italians, because the Romans were from Italy. So we could say the Italians are Christ killers. But that doesn't mean no one says that. You never hear that said. The Italians killed their God. They hanged Jesus on the cross. But sometimes you will hear preachers talk about that about the Jews. Makes no sense, at least not to my mind, and not to the church's mind. So, is there some sort of conflict between the early Christian community, which was almost completely Jewish, and other Jews who did not accept Jesus as the Messiah? Yes, there was a conflict. There was a debate, and even sometimes more than a debate. But you don't want to confuse the later Christian polemic with what actually might have happened. Just because there's a polemic, there's an argument with Jewish communities that rejected Jesus' claims to being the Messiah with, what we can say actually did happen. So why was Jesus executed? Well, the short answer is we don't know. We don't know. It's that simple. The Gospels present several, albeit not always clear, reasons why Jesus' opponents wanted him dead. And maybe that's close to the truth. It may not have been one actual thing that Jesus did. It may just have been a snowball effect where, Jesus does something and it's like, okay, I don't really like that. And he does something else and it's like, where's this going, Jesus? And then Jesus does more things and it's like, okay, now there's open opposition. This guy's got to go. So maybe that's accurate. It was a conglomeration. The whole thing kind of came together and crystallized. Like all these things Jesus did lead to us needing to get rid of him. The Jewish leadership was gathered in this community called the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin. And it comes from a Greek word, actually. It's not a Hebrew word or a Jewish word. It's taken from Greek, which means to be seated with or seated together. Soon means together or with. And hedros or hedradzo means to be seated or sitting down together. Okay, so it was a supreme council of the Jews that would make decisions about religious decisions on how Jews were to follow the Jewish law and practice. It could also, in other times, impose the death penalty. But since, again, as I told you, the Jews were a conquered people, they could not do that. The Romans would not allow them to do that. So for the Jewish leadership, what were some of the problems they had with Jesus? Well, one problem was that they thought he was a violator of God's law. For example, he would violate the Sabbath. He would apparently allow people to do work on the Sabbath, which you're not supposed to do. On the seventh day of the week, you're supposed to rest. Right? And that's in the Ten Commandments. So Jesus is breaking one of the Ten Commandments, which comes directly from God. So that was serious business. Just find this here. Let's see what we want here. So, for example, in Luke chapter 6, this is on the PowerPoint. There's a Sabbath controversy where there's a back and forth. The Pharisees are criticizing Jesus' followers for breaking the Sabbath. Jesus, says, I am Lord of the Sabbath, so I have control over what people can do on the Sabbath. I can give them permission to break this. It sounds like he's saying I can give them permission to break the Sabbath. And in verse 11, which is the end of this story, the Pharisees go away. Actually, I'm sorry. That's that controversy. But I forgot this. He heals a man on the Sabbath as well, which could be seen as a work. And Jesus and the Pharisees, the religious leaders, tell him not to do it, not to perform this healing, or don't perform a cure. And Jesus does it anyways. And verse 11, the religious leaders became enraged and discussed together what they might do to Jesus. Now, it doesn't say condemn him to death, but it's kind of an ominous statement by Luke. What are we going to do about Jesus? Because he's broken the Sabbath in our eyes. So that was something. Jesus made a claim, or seemed to make a claim, that he was able to destroy and rebuild the temple. This comes up in the Gospel of Mark when Jesus is put on trial before the Sanhedrin. And people come forward and say, this man said he could destroy the temple. That was serious business. That was like a form of treason or insurrection. It was not just the fact that it was an attack on the place where God existed amongst the Jews. The Jews believed God lived in the temple. It was his house. And to attack, there was like a direct attack on God himself to say you could destroy his home and then rebuild it. So that was a very serious thing. The fact that Jesus also made this attack on the temple, or said he could destroy it, might have also gotten the attention of Pontius Pilate and the Romans. Because, as I said, it could sound like insurrection, like Jesus was trying, he wanted to burn everything down, and the Romans certainly didn't want that. They wanted the status quo. But it comes up in Jesus' trial. A little interesting detail about that in Mark's Gospel is that, and you'll probably know this if you did read the Gospel of Mark, it comes up in Jesus' trial at the end of the Gospel, but nowhere in Mark's Gospel does Jesus ever make that claim. He never says that anywhere in the Gospel of Mark. Now, you will find that claim in other Gospels, like the Gospel of John, where Jesus says, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up again. So it's interesting why, it seems like a mistake. This charge of Jesus destroying the temple is brought up as like a major charge against Jesus at his trial. And Mark seems to forget telling the story of when Jesus actually made that claim. But okay, so apparently Jesus did that. Jesus claimed to be God's son. Perhaps literally, even God himself. This is clearer in some Gospels than in others, But and we'll learn when we talk about who Jesus was and we talk about the Messiah. Kings of Israel could be called sons of God. It's kind of like God adopts the kings and rulers of Israel as his own children. It doesn't mean they're divine figures necessarily. So it's not always clear what Jesus means by referring to himself as the son. Does he just mean he's a king figure like one of the kings of Israel? He's a son of God. He's an adopted child. Or is he kind of like saying, wink, wink, I'm somehow God? Some people seem to take it that way in the Sanhedrin. That would get you killed. Because that violates the first commandment of the Ten Commandments. I am the Lord your God, have no gods except me. And Jesus, a man, is making himself God. Jesus raises a man called Lazarus from the dead. This is the reason that comes up in the Gospel of John, and it's a very unusual reason. You might say, well, why would the fact that Jesus raised a man from the dead bring some people in the Sanhedrin to the conclusion that he had to die? Well, the problem was they thought Jesus was going to become too powerful. The fact that Jesus was not just some miracle worker, but he was even a person who could raise people back from the dead. They thought, this is going to get the attention of the Romans, and they might wipe us all out. Jesus was becoming too powerful, evidenced by the fact that he could actually raise corpses out of the tomb and bring them back to life. So this disturbs some people in the Sanhedrin. And so the fact that he raises Lazarus from the dead is given as a reason why he should be put to death, just for political purposes. It's not necessarily out of any animosity for Jesus, but just for political purposes. It might get the attentions of the Romans, who might think that Jesus is too powerful a person. He might direct his powers against them, these supernatural powers, and they might, preemptively the Romans might just decide to try and wipe out the Jews, Finally, Jesus says and does things that imply that he is the Messiah, this King Savior that God would send in the future. People think he's the Christ. And if he's not, and members of the Sanhedrin don't believe he is, they think he's a liar, then he has to be dealt with. If he's a false Messiah is worse than the real Messiah, Actually, you might reverse that. Sometimes the real Messiah is worse than a false Messiah because you don't know what you're getting. But anyways, to their mind, having a man who's a false Messiah going around and misleading people was a very bad situation, and so Jesus needed to be dealt with. So these are several reasons that come up in the Gospels for why his opponents wanted him dead. We'll talk about the Messiah more. And I give some of them to you here on the PowerPoint. For example, in Jesus' trial in the Gospel of Mark chapter 14. Anyone would like to read this for me? Do me a solid, right, Ms. Moore? I got you, Mr. Coons. Ms. Rarick. Yeah, go ahead.
Jesus, the entire some took the stand and testified falsely against him, alleging, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands,
yeah.
and within 3 days I will build another not made with hands. The high priest rose before the assembly and questioned Jesus, saying, have you no answer? What are these that testify against you? But he was silent and answered nothing. Again, the high priest asked him and said to him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus answered, I am. He will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power, coming with the clouds of heaven. At that, the high priest tore his garments and said, what further need have we for this? You have heard of the blasphemy. What do you think? They all condemned him as deserving to die.
Okay, thank you. So this, in the Gospel of Mark, is the primary reason that he gives for why Jesus had to die from the perspective of the Sanhedrin. He does not name the high priest, but the high priest was a man named Joseph ben Caiaphas. Ben is the Hebrew word for son of, so Joseph, son of Caiaphas. Or he's simply called, even though, now just go with this, even though his first name is Joseph, he's frequently just called Caiaphas. Okay, he's known by where he came from, Caiaphas. And he was high priest from, remember correctly, 16, or I think it's 18, 18 to 46 AD. Now, again, kind of like with the situation with, darn it, you don't show up and then you show up. There you are. Okay. With our friend Pontius Pilate, there we go. We had Pontius Pilate referenced in the Gospels, in the New Testament, the Christian writings. He was mentioned by Josephus Flavius, etc., and that was about it. The same thing with Caiaphas. Our only evidence for the existence of this man, Caiaphas, was in the New Testament where he's referenced. He's named, not by Mark, interestingly enough, but Caiaphas is named in the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John. So we have the name Caiaphas. And Josephus Flavius mentions Caiaphas, and that's where we get a lot of our historical information. Josephus also tells us that his name was actually Joseph ben Caiaphas, not just Caiaphas, okay, as we get from the Gospels. Well, in 1990, archaeologists found this ossuary, or a bone box. That's how they buried people. They put their bones, eventually when the body fully decomposed, the grave would be dug up and they would take the bones of the body and they put it in a box. And in Israel, they found this bone box, this ossuary, it's called. Very ornate, so clearly the person whose bones were in it was either a rich person or certainly someone of influence, someone who was important. And on the side of this bone box, we have inscribed in Aramaic, not Hebrew, Yehoseph bar Caiaphas. See this here and there, okay? Here you can see it. This is kind of Hebrew writes from right to left. So this is a Q in English. This is a P. And this last one is kind of like a guttural sound, like a okay? And they don't write vowels, so you have to kind of put them in there. So, Caiaphas. Okay. Most scholars think this is a reference to Joseph ben Caiaphas, because he's the only person we know of from this period with the same name. I mean, Joseph was not necessarily an unusual name, but Joseph ben Caiaphas is pretty specific. And the fact that someone etched this into the side of this ossuary, which clearly held the bones of an influential person from this time period, they want to tell us who was in this bone box. So a lot of scholars think that this is an actual historical or archaeological evidence for the existence of this man Caiaphas. But if you don't like that, there's better evidence, because some scholars debate it because his name is spelled a little bit differently. There's another inscription on the box which, has his name a little bit differently. He also wasn't called a high priest, so people say, wouldn't they say he's the high priest? If he was, then they would just scribble his name on the side. Okay, fine. So it's not 100%. However, we do have this. It's called the Miriam ossuary, another bone box that was found in 2011 for this woman called Miriam. We would say Mary. Again, Miriam was not an uncommon name amongst Jewish women, just like Jesus, as you can see, because she's called, where is it here? Miriam, the daughter of Yeshua, the daughter of Jesus. Okay, not Jesus of Nazareth, some other Jesus. It's not an uncommon name. So this is the bone box of Mary, the daughter of Jesus, who was the son of Caiaphas, priest of Ma'adziah from Bet Imri. Okay, so here it does identify this woman as connected to the priest Caiaphas. And it even tells us kind of the group that he belonged to, Ma'adziah, all the priests of the Jewish temple belonged to different groups or fraternities, and each group would serve in the temple during different periods of the year. So he was of the group Mahadzia of the house of Imri, Beit Imri. Right? And so most scholars think this is definitely an indirect reference to Caiaphas. It's not his bone box, it's the Miriam's, this woman's bone box. So here we have archaeological evidence of this man Caiaphas who presided over the trial of Jesus of Nazareth in the Sanhedrin. All right. I'll stop there because I want to talk more about what we read from the Gospel of Mark about the trial, and there's much more to say about it, but I'll get into it on Tuesday. So have a good weekend. God bless you all.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
What is the quiz? So, like,
Oh, yes, an update on the quiz. I talked to the people in teaching, learning, and innovation, and they're going to elevate it to Canvas. But the response I got back was that Canvas is infuriatingly unhelpful in responding to requests. They try to let you work it out first, and then they'll help you. So who knows how long it's going to take Canvas to fix it. So I have a couple options. I might use an online test-taking site, and to send you a link so you can do it on that site, and then I'll put your grades into Canvas manually. Or I might print out the quiz and just give it to you and have you take it home and bring it back.
Okay.
Or something. I haven't decided yet.
okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Have a good weekend.
You too. Thank you, Miss. You're welcome. You too, sir. Now. I gotta change that. Have a good day, sir.